I'm Laura Larsen. I'm going to be your host for this webinar, which is Seeding the Public Interest, and it's my great privilege to share it with you today. Our two speakers are Ken Larsen and Terry Boehm, which I will introduce in a minute. So this is from the National Farmers Union, which is a membership-based national organization for the collective voices of Canadian farmers working together to fight for agroecology and food sovereignty. Everyone else, the 98% of Canadians who care deeply about our food system but don't farm, are invited to join the National Farmers Union as associate members. Your membership is important to the NFU, and I hope you'll join us. We'd like to celebrate our sponsors who've made this workshop possible and supported and worked with the NFU for many years. Thank you to them for sharing our vision and supporting our work. I'd also like to highlight the upcoming workshops in November. It's a pretty busy month, so I really encourage you to come and try, and many of you can. They're going to culminate in our dynamic national convention, which is truly democracy in action. We hope you'll join us for that as well. And you can see the workshops on your screen. I'd like to highlight also the keynote speaker for the convention, who is Seth Klein. And he's speaking, I think we have a title of his book. He's speaking on A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is a great speaker, and the topic is pretty critical at this point. He's going to speak at 3 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, November 26th. Please correct for your time zone and join us so we can learn how to mobilize to address climate change. I'd also like to take time to offer that you can pick up the books by authors at this book and other authors at the convention at Turning the Tide bookstore, which is an independent bookstore in Saskatoon, and they do online ordering. And you can find the link on the nfu.ca website. They also have a lot of other really cool books. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I come to you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. The NFU organization recognizes that Canada is a settler colonial country and that Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers share common ground as people who are on the land and who feed our communities. We promote and support Indigenous land rights and Indigenous food sovereignty. We also celebrate the leadership that Indigenous communities are taking in the preservation of seeds, something we should all be really happy about. The NFU agrees that seeds are a vibrant and vital foundation for Indigenous food sovereignty. And without further ado, I'm really pleased to introduce you to our Seeding the Public Interest panel on the topic of Canadian seed systems. This topic is really important because seeds are the foundation of what we do for farming and how we feed ourselves. And our speakers today are Terry Boehm and Ken Larsen. Terry Boehm is the past president of the National Farmers Union. He's been very involved in seed legislation and variety registration systems in Canada and is actively working to defend the Canadian Grain Commission, pardon me, and supply management, which is to maintain these institutions with their original intent to protect and advance the interests of farmers. Ken Larsen is a grain and forages farmer from Alberta, and he's been involved in numerous recreational, environmental, cultural, and scientific organizations, and has worked on agricultural marketing, public plant breeding, and transportation issues. And so I won't keep you any longer, and I will turn it over to our first speaker, Terry. Okay, Ken, I think you're up first then.
Okay, I'll just share my screen here. There, that should be the slideshow. Is it there? Yes?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And I take it everybody can hear me clearly enough? Okay, good. This will be a brief history of plant breeding from Caesar to Stephen Harper. And I hope you'll find it somewhat interesting. It's certainly a fascinating topic for me. And if I get rabbiting on, someone will have to bring a shepherd's crook in and grab me off the stage. But I'll try to be succinct. So where do we start? Well, farming is really the result of 300 generations of farmers. And agriculture started in the Middle East, Central America, and Asia about 9,000 years ago, and about simultaneously. Plants then were improved by selection. In other words, the farmer selected the best plants and saved some of the seed back and replanted it for the following crop year. And that was how plant varieties were improved. Those improved varieties were freely shared amongst the farm community. And wheat, corn, and rice were the results. And these food crops are the common heritage of humanity. So the genetics of bread wheat are quite interesting. Bread wheat really arose from a goat grass, a wild wheat grass back about 8,000 years ago. And that spontaneously crossed with a wild goat grass. And that created what's called emmer, which is 28 chromosomes. And that was what was harvested. You'll notice the emmer has these long fronds on it by and large, and the head itself is very tightly woven, so it doesn't really spread. It spreads quite well by getting caught on animal fur. The emmer spontaneously crossed again with another wild goat grass, and that created bread wheat about 8,000 years ago. And it was bread wheat that made possible all the great ancient empires of Egypt, Persia, Carthage, and Rome. It was wheat was portable. It was produced on very large scales, farms, and distributed throughout the empires. Rome was the most successful of these wheat-based empires. It lasted roughly 650 years or so, and in that time it had numerous famines and feasts because of the rise of wheat rust that would wipe out crops. But those empires were able to move wheat in from other parts of the empire to feed people, and of course it allowed the farmers in the area where there was a rust infestation, because generally it was a disease like rust that wiped out their crops, to select the plants that survived the infestation and plant them for the future. So that worked quite well. You can see here's a picture of a Roman mill and bakery. That worked quite well until about 476 when the empire fell apart. And for the next 1,200 years, as the empire broke up into little warring warlord factions, the sharing of wheat disappeared. Wheat was still grown, but it gradually died out in most places because rust or some other disease would infest an area. And so wheat finally it went from being a very commonly available foodstuff to being something that only the aristocracy got to have. But nothing lasts forever. And about 1,000 years later, in the 1500s, wheat started to become a commodity again, mostly coming out of the Ukraine and some parts of France. And by the 1840s, it was a commercial crop once again. And in 1857, Britain sent Palliser to survey Western Canada looking for wheatland. Now, Palliser thought he found wheatland, and 10 years later, Canada was formed. The other thing that happened was another scientific revolution was in 1866, Gregor Mendel published his observations on crossbreeding of pea plants. This was the first major advance in plant breeding in 9,000 years. We didn't have the internet back then, so the information Mendel found wasn't disseminated widely and quickly, but it was disseminated. In 1884, the first Canadian grain terminal was built at Thunder Bay. It mostly handled wheat coming out of Manitoba, and the results were spotty and unreliable because they were trying to grow wheats that were more suited to other climates. So what happened is in 1886, Ottawa passed the Experimental Farm Act, and William Saunders started doing the first wheat crosses at the New Dominion Experimental Farm. This is a first in the world. So Charles Saunders, his son, William Saunders' son, carried on the work of his father and started using systematic crossbreeding, and he created Marquis wheat, which was the first modern bread wheat that thrives on the North American prairies. It was a cross between a wheat out of the Ukraine and hard red Calcutta. And this was a major technological innovation and an advance in cereal agriculture, and it came from public plant breeding. and ended up being grown on about 20 million acres of land from Canada south to Nebraska. It's really the basis of the modern wheat trade. Canada opted, however, not to go for bulk production, but for quality production. I'll just show you this little graph. This represents world wheat production, total world wheat production about 10 years ago, about 600 million metric tons. And you'll notice that a little tiny bit is the highest quality wheat. Canada produces about half the very highest quality wheats grown in the world, and those are used for primarily for bread wheat and pastas. So what's our high quality based on? Well, it's based on public research, and we have what's called a merit-based registration system. And merit is a big word for the grain variety must be agronomically fit. That means it has to grow on the prairies. It has to be disease resistant and hardy. And the other important part of merit is it has to meet customer quality standards for milling and baking. Now, who decides merit? That's decided by, in Canadian fashion, by a committee of farmers working with scientists and customers through the Western Grains Research Foundation. So who benefits from public research and our merit-based registration system? Well, obviously we farmers do, because we get an impartial process. It gives us high quality seed that grows on our farms. Not a bad thing. Consumers are guaranteed of high quality food. And scientists at the universities and Ag Canada can carry out impartial work for the benefit of farmers and consumers and the public, not necessarily for shareholders somewhere else. That's why Canadian grain is the highest quality in the world. And it has to be the highest quality because we have such a huge distance between our growing area and port that we need the extra value from that to offset our rather unpleasant climate by comparison and our very great distances to tidewater. So to recap, prairie farming was globalized in the 1870s. About 70% of our grain gets exported overseas, and we have an integrated system that involves public plant breeding and respect for our customers. Now, I'll just give you an example of how that really worked in practice. A few years ago, you may remember that Monsanto was pushing the introduction of GM wheat in Canada. So the wheat board went around to all our customers in the world and asked, well, will you buy this stuff? And to a person, they said, no, we won't buy it. Even if there's one grain in a shipment, we won't take it. So it didn't meet our merit standards. It might have grown here very well. Who knows? Who cares? Because it couldn't be sold. So why is there still a big push to end public research? A lot of people have described it as putting a meter on the sun, which it is, because you would be charging farmers and the public royalties for using the genome that's been created by farmers for 9,000 years. Up until the 80s, about 100% of breeding in Canada for cereals and oil grains was done through our public plant breeding system. It was focused research directed by farmers through the Western Grains Research Foundation and largely funded by farmers. But in the 80s, the fad was for privatization, so the process was started to privatize the cereals genome. The problem with that is it makes it harder for the public and universities to get hold of genetic material to work with, and it ends the free exchange of germplasm, and that impedes innovation in plant breeding. So essentially, we're being taken back to 476 AD, and instead of warlords stopping the sharing of seed and genetic materials with swords, it will be the life sciences companies using patents given them by the government and lawyers to stop the free exchange and innovation. So the loss of public research, the private sector goes on a lot about all the money they put into it. In fact, according to the Seed Trade Association, in 2005, they only put $1.1 million into cereals research in Canada. In 2019, in contrast, the Western Grains Research Foundation put $13 million into cereals grain research. And in total, they put about $196 million into public research since 1981. So I'm just going to walk you through very briefly, and my apologies to some of the plant scientists who I know are on this call, because this is a very superficial view of what goes on, but I'll just walk you briefly through what that $196 million buys. So stage one of a varietal development takes about 7 to 10 years. That was what Saunders did. And that involves a number of things. The researchers take the best crosses and work with farmers, and then move on to segregating generations where they grow more of them. And about 1 in 1,000 of those resulting crosses gets moved on to the pre-registration trials of the crosses, where the plant breeders compare the various lines on various criteria. And then there's pre-variety registration trials of crosses, which takes another 3 years. And at that point, there are some really good crosses that look promising enough to go into the propagation system, into the variety proving system. And at that point, we have a Canadian committee that sits down, decides merit. And that consists of farmers, the Western Grains Research Foundation, the scientists and plant breeders involved. And they choose which varieties go on to finishing, or at least they did. That goes to stage 2 varietal finishing, which can take anywhere between 2 and 8 years, depending on the techniques they use. And that involves a number of steps. I'll just quickly walk through them. It's multiplied to produce pedigreed seed for the seed growers, who are farmers who specialize in pedigreed seed growing. Once they get it, they multiply it further, and the seed grower, the pedigreed seed grower, actually has to do a couple of crop years. He actually walks through the fields and rogues the first couple of years of the crops and pulls out any plants that don't look right or aren't breeding true. So it's a very labor-intensive process. And then the pedigreed seed grower finally has enough seed to sell to commercial farmers like me as bulk certified pedigreed seed, which is good. And any royalties I pay for that seed goes back into the Western Grain Research Foundation, and 100% is reinvested in the breeding programs. Something bad happened in 2004. The Harper administration put a choke point into the system. So our most expensive part of the process is this part in here. And Harper, that's what provides the raw materials really for the later stages. Harper put a choke point in here where he gave the private agrochemical seed companies the right to decide which promising varieties go on to commercialization. The other part is, under the Harper model, those royalties that I pay will now go to the agrochemical seed company, not necessarily back to the Western Grains Research Foundation. So we don't know quite, once those royalties disappear into those companies, we don't know where they'll end up. So who benefits from ending public research in our merit-based registration system? Well, it's pretty straightforward. If you look at this slide, this is, you'll see the life sciences companies here, commercial seeds, animal pharmaceuticals, and agrochemicals, and you'll see a lot of overlap, Merck, BAS, Bayer, all sorts of familiar names there. I'll just bring up a simpler version. These are the principal seed companies in the world now. They have about 67% of the world market in seeds and chemicals, agrochemicals. Now, so the orange part represents the seeds of their portfolio, and this represents the agrochemicals. So Bayer now owns Monsanto, and Corteva is the merger of DuPont and Dow Corporation. And of course, ChemChina is the government of China's chemistry company, and it bought out Syngenta. There are a few other smaller seed companies based out of Europe, and a few, they have some subsidiaries here, but essentially these are the big players on the world market for agrochemicals and seed. So do they do a good job? Well, we've had a bit of an experiment on that in Canada of comparing private versus public seed development. In 1968, the first human consumption canola, rapeseed, was developed by Ag Canada through our public system. And in 1978, the canola genome was given to the private sector to develop. So why was it given to the private sector? Why was well, it was because of the promises of GM technology. Monsanto made a great deal about how great this thing was, management simplicity, less herbicide use, conservation, environmentally friendly. And it was sold to farmers as simple. All we had to do was seed, spray, and harvest. And Who doesn't like to do that? And of course, it was sold to the public as environmentally friendly with less chemical use. That turned out not to be entirely accurate. So when you grow GM canola, next year it becomes a weed in the GM soybeans you may be growing, or the GM corn you may be growing in Manitoba, or the GM alfalfa you may be growing in Ontario. So what you have to do is come up with a different herbicide application, not only to save your GM canola from weeds or your GM soybeans from weeds, but to get rid of the GM canola or the GM corn or the alfalfa. So you can see that each one of those combinations brings in a new herbicide application. And of course, the reverse becomes the case as well. The soybeans, corn, and alfalfa become weeds in your GM canola. So you have to have a special spray for getting rid of them. So that actually represents more herbicide use rather than less. So the question is there a public interest versus a private interest here? Of course, the chemical company, the ag seed companies are interested in selling both seeds and chemicals. And I suspect from my experience in Alberta's petrochemical industry that the petrochemicals are even more profitable than the seeds. So I'll just move along here if this thing will do this for me. But the private sector always claims that they do everything better. So we've had studies that show how the private sector and the public sector work in increasing yields. So the average spring wheat yield between 81 and 2000 was about 1.25% per year, which beat canola substantially at less than 1% a year. When you move on, canola kind of caught up a little bit, but it didn't catch up with the gains in wheat yield. So these are substantial differences between the two models. But the private sector says we're more financially efficient sometimes. So let's just take a look at what the costs involved were. So the investment to keep wheat going is estimated at about $25 million a year through a public plant breeding system. The investment needed to keep canola going per year is about $80 million in the private company plant system. So that's from Dr. R. Graff, Crop Yield and Production Trends in Western Canada from March 2013. And it's a very well-regarded study and I think accurate. Now, what's important to me, of course, is farm cost of seed. And the average farm cost for privately developed seed is about 7 times greater than the public seed. Wheat and barley typically cost between $10 and $11 per acre to put in, and canola is around $75 an acre by the time all is said and done. Plus, you have to buy the proprietary herbicide as well. So there is a public interest and a private interest, and they are in conflict. So I'll just give you one quick other example of that. Many of you maybe have read about DDT being sprayed all over North America. The reason that happened was in the wheat belt is they didn't have wheats that were resistant to wheat stem sawfly in the United States. Our public plant breeding system actually came up with something called rescue wheat, which was licensed in 1946. So we never did use a lot of DDT on our prairie wheat. A lot of midge-tolerant wheats have been developed out of that line and are now used on Canadian prairie farms. So the estimate is having the insect-tolerant wheat is worth about $300 million a year to prairie farmers and better yields and lower pesticide costs. That means there's not as much pesticide on our wheat as there may be in other places. Now, let's go back to canola. Canola still uses a lot of insecticides. And our public plant breeding system has a bunch of hairy canola varieties sitting there waiting for varietal proofing, as it were, but they're not being developed. So should a company that also makes insecticides and herbicides be the gatekeeper of this type of research and the finishing of new grains and oilseed varieties? I would suggest perhaps that's not a prudent way to run things. Again, public interest versus private interest. That's a pretty good example, I think. So the loss, just to sum up, the loss of public research means the loss of 300 generations of cooperation, loss of public interest and impartial science, And thanks to government policy, the giant life sciences companies are controlling the commons and are putting a meter on the sun. So thank you for your kind attention. And I guess we'll turn it over to Terry now.
Yeah, questions will be after both presentations.
Okay.
So if you could stop sharing your screen.
Effort to do that. There we are.
There.
Good.
And our second speaker is Terry Boehm, who's the former president of the National Farmers Union. So I will turn it over to Terry. And you're on mute, Terry. Perfect.
I've said hello, bonjour, hola. And that's about the extent of my language skills. I'll start there. Well, CAN is a hard act to follow, and I've experienced this many times in different other forums, but I'll try and put my little piece into this. And I think CAN illustrated quite well some of the differences between a privatized plant development system, varietal development, and control versus a public system. And I think largely you could characterize the public system as cooperative, collaborative, open, and alive. And the private systems that have been developing, not just here in Canada, the US and Europe and other places, Australia, etc., the private systems largely end up being litigious, extractive, closed, protected, dominated by multinationals, and restrictive and actually sterile. And they seek to sterilize the seed system by using legal instruments, of which many have been imposed on us in recent years, and also by using biological methods and the focus on hybrid seeds, for example, is a partial sterilization of the seed system, and because they often do not, on second planting, produce the results that farmers desire. So what we have to realize is that there's actually a social contract in all of these systems, these legal systems, built up around seeds, around distribution, around public research institutions, et cetera, but in recent years, there's been a craze to attach intellectual property rights around seeds. And this is one of the main methods of extracting extra revenues out of farmers, extra rents. But the other side of the equation is that in Canada, in our varietal registration system, it's not until a variety is approved and registered that it actually becomes valuable. And so we as the public make that variety valuable, whether it's produced from the private sector or the public sector, because it cannot be sold commercially and not be taken up by farmers for commercial production unless it's a registered variety. There are some exemptions, and largely those exemptions occur where hybridization has taken place in corn and similar crops to that aren't subject to varietal registration. So what we've had happening is this shift, essentially the seed industry, the multinationals, et cetera, are attempting to convince the public and farmers themselves that we have a crisis. We have a crisis of innovation. We have a crisis of investment. We're falling behind. We're not going to be competitive unless, of course, we adopt all of these ever more restrictive controls on farmers, of which plant producer rights legislation has been one, a serious impact. And it has different iterations that I'll get into a little later. So recently, actually with the financing, partial financing of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, we've had an entity created called Seed Synergy. And the members of that are the Canadian Seed Growers Association, the Canadian Seed Trade Association, Canadian Seed Institute, Commercial Seed Analysts Association, Canadian Plant Technology Agency, and CropLife Canada. And their proposal has been, again, farmers are left out of the equation, the public's left out of the equation, but they want to create value. And the value they want to create is for essentially private holders of seed varieties. And the way they want to do that is through one of two mechanisms. The first mechanism is called the endpoint royalty, where when a farmer delivered his production to a grain elevator, for example, he would be charged a royalty on his entire production. But the other more elegant solution that they're advancing, and as H.L. Mencken said, that for every problem, there's a solution that's simple, elegant, and wrong, and this is one of those wrong ones, is to charge a royalty on farm-saved seed. So this would be called a trailing royalty, and it would be established on varieties that have been registered under the latest iteration of plant breeders' rights, the UPOV 91, that came into effect in 2015 in Canada. And essentially, farmers would be paying for the privilege of saving their own seed for planting it on their own holdings. We've been pushed back significantly in terms of what we understand to be a traditional use of seeds for some time now. And just a few generations ago, people would not have imagined that they couldn't exchange or they couldn't sell seeds to their neighbors. The restrictions and litigations that are put around that are the legal forms of sterilizing that seed. So now farmers are left with a farmer's privilege, where they can save and reuse seed on their own farm and plant it for their own use. But again, it's sterilized. It only goes as far as that farm. Now, who are the players in these various players in the seed synergy proposals? And we saw this spring some wheat varieties being put forward on a private initiative to charge the farm-saved seed royalty, the trailing royalty. The Canadian Seed Trade Association, as Ken described, some of the players in the seed industry, the multinationals are, for example, BASF Canada, Bayer Crop Science, Cantera Seeds, Corteva AgriScience, which is Dow, DuPont, Pride Seeds, Syngenta Canada, again, which is Chem China, Stoke Seeds, and a few others. This is one of the major players of this group. And another one, of course, is CropLife Canada. And oddly enough, the Canadian Seed Trade Association and CropLife Canada are composed of BASF Canada, Bayer Crop Science, Cantera Seeds, Corteva, Nutrien, Syngenta, Univar, almost the identical players. And the Canadian Seed Institute is made up of board members that come from the Canadian Seed Trade Association, CropLife Canada, the Commercial Seed Analysts Association, Canadian Plant Technology Agency. They all have very vested interests in maximizing the revenue and rent extraction. They're not particularly concerned about innovation, although they would lead us to believe that. The innovation is I think, in revenue extraction techniques. So we've come to a point where we significantly have to push back on these mechanisms and recognize what they are. They're really international intrusions, and they're attempting through UPOV, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the Union pour la protection des obtentions végétales, or protection of new plant varieties. Started up in 1960. It's had various iterations. Through patents, through UPOV, through these various mechanisms, farmers are being pushed into a place where the very act of saving seed is criminalized or frowned upon. They have some exemptions now. They have a farmer's privilege, it's optional. There's a bunch of mechanisms and elements that can take that away. And we have a bunch of trade agreements that even if we had a progressive government come along, the issues around reversing some of these things would actually result in the farmers being, or the public governments being required to compensate these entities for lost future profits. So I guess one of the fundamental pieces in this, again, is we had a public system that was collaborative and open and alive. And we're increasingly shifting it to a litigious, privatized system. Again, under the false idea that this is the only place, the private sector is the only place that is capable of innovating. Ken's illustrations pointed out that in actual fact, they're not any better, and actually somewhat less better than the public sector. That's actually been hamstrung and crippled for decades now by reductions in financing and to a certain extent been forced into accessing at least half of their funding from private sources through the matching investment initiative. So we have these terms: innovation, modernization, government enabled. Government enabled for the private sector is the public is to enforce corporate advantages. And in all of these things, these mechanisms really are not about innovation, whatever that might be. They're about maximizing revenue and extraction for some pretty unwieldy international corporations. And I think in terms of the details of these mechanisms, I can certainly get into it. But I just want to give you one example about the strangleholds we're trying to place around varietal development. And in the UPOV legislation that we have and many other countries in the world have, in terms of somebody innovating a new variety, creating a new variety, Article 5.3 talks about essentially derived varieties in the UPOV legislation, which is the template for our plant breeders' rights legislation. And an essentially derived variety is defined as predominantly derived from the initial variety, or from a variety that is self-predominantly derived from the initial variety, while retaining the expression of the essential characteristics, and I'm sorry to the translators, that result from the genotype or combination of genotypes of the initial varieties. It is clearly distinguishable from the initial variety, and except for the differences which result from the act of derivation, it conforms to the initial variety in the expression of essential characteristics. Essentially, what that means is that whoever has registered that first variety and attempts to prove that it's essentially derived, the new variety is essentially derived from that, they receive all the privileges and legal advantages from that first variety. So what we're moving into is a further monopolization and consolidation in seeds and control. Plant breeders have exclusive rights to collect royalties anywhere in the production system. If not collected at the time of seed sale, it's called the cascading right. They have extensive other rights, which if people are interested in, I can elaborate more on, but I won't for the purposes of this. And I think I'm approaching my 20 minutes, and I know there's a question and answer period, but I think the core message that I want to say is that people should think about seeds and the public interest and life itself versus privatization and sterilization that's being conducted through a lot of different legal mechanisms, and I'll close there.
You have a bit more time if you'd like to take it, Terry.
Oh, okay. I was just timing by my kitchen clock.
Maybe my watch is slow, but you can have 6 more minutes if you'd like.
If you'd like the documents to be shared on screen, let me know as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I think one of the pieces is that I think that's really important, going back to what farmers can do with seeds, is that in the latest round of legislation, farmers have a privilege to save and reuse seed and plant on their own holdings. But that can be changed at any point and by any parameter. So it could be eliminated for certain crop kinds. It could be eliminated for, or it could be restricted to a number of planting cycles, maybe 1 or 2 years. It could be restricted by the type of farm, by the type of crop, et cetera, et cetera. And this can be done by a regulatory change, a publication in the Canada Gazette flowing out of the Ministry of Agriculture. It can also be done by something that's called incorporation by reference, which was actually introduced in our plant breeders' rights legislation in 2015. And incorporation by reference, the minister can essentially deem a document, a publication, whether from public sources, private sources, or otherwise, that this is our regulation. And the author, there's static or non-static documents. There's either ones that are non-static, that are fixed, that can't be changed, but are part of our regulatory environment, or non-static, that the author of the document can change. And of course, this is very worrisome, and this does not just occur in plant breeders' rights legislation, but across our legislative realm. It makes it very difficult for citizens to monitor what's going on. However, they're subjected to what increasingly, I think, will become a privatized regulation of our activities. So I don't know if I used up my remaining time there, but on the positive side, after all of that, we can say no. And if it comes to the point where we have to all violate these restrictions around how seeds are going to be used, they can't arrest us all. And we do have power, and we do need to stand up, and we do not need to be convinced. And there's many out there that sort of accept this mantra that only the private sector can give us innovations and advances, and we won't be competitive without it. But we can say no, and we can push back. And essentially, most of the advances in human society came from people saying no and pushing back and saying, we have a better idea. And in part, several years ago, when the UPOB 91 plant breeders' rights legislation was coming along, I wrote a document that was up a little bit earlier called The Fundamental Principles of a Farmer's Seed Act. And that encapsulates some of the pushback and some of the things that I think should happen, and that would generate a system in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Ken, for your presentations.
I'd just like to jump in for a moment, if I could, Madam Chairman.
If it's quick, because I know a lot of people have a lot of questions.
Okay, well, it's very quick. Just on there's actually the committee that decides what goes ahead isn't really directly connected to Western Grains Research Foundation. Western Grains Research Foundation provides the money. The committee is made up of a whole pile of people, most of whom are involved in farming in one way or the other. So it really isn't formally a subcommittee of the Western Grains Research Foundation. It's I know that's a little inside baseball, but it is pertinent. So thank you.